The Greece modern experiment is a success. What does Greece do when there's another European crisis? How coalesced is Europe right now?
Well, much more so. Tom, in an environment where the Americans and Chinese aren't really talking to each other, the Europeans are taking the lead on climate regulations. Their rules and regs on privacy, on data, are the most advanced in the world and increasingly being taken up by other countries because they're out in front. That's not to say that their economies are all performing incredibly well, but the lessons taken from the near-death experience of Grexit and from the disaster that was the Brexit negotiations and has had a much bigger impact on the UK than the EU, I think has helped to bring the EU together. And the Europeans ended up responding to COVID in a much more coherent and cohesive way, both in terms of the vaccines as well as economic restructuring and rebuilding. All of that means they're in better position these days.
You speak of a misjudgment of President Biden in America, whether it's China or Europe. What is the prism that they look through now when they observe this president?
I think they recognize that even though they like Biden much more, certainly the Europeans, with the exception of Viktor Orban, and he is the exception that proves the rule from Hungary, they all prefer Biden by a long mile. And yet they see that the United States now has two presidents in a row who are much more taken with domestic affairs than their interest in the continued strength of the transatlantic alliance. On top of that, there is an ongoing pivot towards Asia that the Europeans are generally not considered either very aligned for or much of a priority for. And so, I mean, frankly, even though Trump and Biden could not be more different as leaders, as individuals, the Europeans see more continuity and they don't like it. Doesn't mean that they have good alternatives at this point, because absent the UK, absent Angela Merkel in short order, and, with the French president facing his own difficult elections in the next 6 months, it's not like the Europeans are replete with individual strong national leaders. Right. Kyriakos and Draghi are probably two of the few you'd point to right now.
Ian, when we look forward, particularly with respect to this alliance to deal with China, how much is the European Union getting left out of an alliance that increasingly looks like the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom?
Well, the United States has the Quad. The United States has this new AUKUS agreement, which has been described to me privately as Five Eyes plus. So intelligence sharing technology and some national security. Well, the fact is that when the United States looks at China, we see China principally as a government through a national security lens. With the sole exception of France, none of the Europeans do. They're much more transactional. And part of the dust-up between the United States and France around all of this is that, on the one hand, the French are the third largest military exporters in the world after the U.S. and Russia, so they're competing with the U.S., and they lost out on the Australians ripping up their contract. On the other, the French have been trying to convince the Europeans to have more focus on security, more focus on building up European defense capacity, and more of a proactive Indo-Pac strategy. Very few countries in Europe are interested in supporting that. So Macron is kind of neither fish nor fowl at this point. Zut alors.
Ian, just to finish up here, we've been talking about Evergrande all morning and the systemic risk, not necessarily financially, but with respect to a housing market in China that is cooling dramatically, and frankly, the fact that policymakers are going to allow this. How does that dovetail into the rising tensions between the China and the Western world, if at all?
Well, as I said, the United States has a president, two presidents now that have been much more focused on domestic policy, America first, and a U.S. foreign policy for the American middle class. The Chinese are focused much more inward as well. Let's remember that, Belt and Road investments have fallen off a cliff over the last 5 years. China's much more focused on their own dual circulation policy commit to the domestic economic, consumer, and supply chain. With Evergrande, I mean, of course, this is a really big financial crisis for the Chinese. And what was their announcement at the UN this week? We're not going to be building any more coal-fired plants outside of China. Yeah, because they're not going to be building much more anything outside of China going forward. That's the real shift. And when I talk to policymakers in Washington, they're still thinking about aggressive Cold War mentality with a China that is trying to take over the world. Increasingly, China's problems are domestic, too.